My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32, and last Christmas I walked into my parents' house already bracing myself. You know that feeling when your family measures your worth by the car you drive or the title on your paycheck, and you're the one who never quite fits? That night, my brother wasted no time mocking me in front of everyone. I thought it would be another holiday where I swallowed it and smiled. But something happened that none of us saw coming, something that turned the whole room upside down. And when it did, the silence that followed was louder than any laughter. Have you ever wondered what it would take for your family to finally see you for who you really are? Snow had been falling all afternoon, turning Cleveland into a quiet gray city under a white blanket. By the time my rideshare pulled up to my parents' house, Christmas lights glowed across the street. The Carter house stood out, every bulb sharp against the night. For most people, it might have looked cheerful. For me, it looked like a stage ready for judgment. The driveway was full, my parents' Subaru on one side, Michael's silver Tesla gleaming on the other like a trophy. Even before I saw him, I knew the car was his way of announcing victory. I grabbed my bag and stood there for a second. A year had passed since I came home, but the wait felt exactly the same. Inside, the heat and smells of roast ham and gingerbread wrapped around me. Voices layered over one another, Mom giving directions, Dad's booming laugh, Aunt Linda's softer tone. And then Michael's laugh, louder, practiced the sound of someone who needed to be noticed. Emily. Mom called from the kitchen without looking. Coats in the closet, shoes in the bin. Don't block the hall, Grace is bringing pie. Hi, Mom, I said, but she had already turned back to the oven. Michael appeared next. Perfect jacket hair combed just right, smile polished. He was 35, but carried himself like the quarterback who never stopped winning. His eyes scanned me, boots, coat, hair, and then the smirk came. Well, well, he said loud enough for everyone nearby. The unemployed have landed. A couple of laughs broke out. Rachel, his wife, came forward in a cream sweater dress and diamond studs. She kissed the air near my cheek. You look cozy, she said, a compliment wrapped in judgment. Thanks, I answered. It's winter. Grace, our youngest sister, sliced bread at the counter. She gave me a small, guilty smile, one that said she noticed but wouldn't interfere. Aunt Linda, though, came straight over and hugged me tightly. Good to see you, honey. You made it through the storm, she whispered. At that moment, she was the only shield in the room. Let's sit before the food cools, Dad announced. His cheer sounded real, but the way his eyes lingered on Michael's Tesla keys on the counter told another story. We took our usual seats. Dad at the head, Mom across from him. Michael to Dad's right, with Rachel beside him. Aunt Linda sat across Grace next to me. The table was set with china candles burning steadily, windows fogged from the heat. From the outside, it was picture perfect. Inside, it was already tense. Michael started the meal the way he always did, by taking the floor. Rates jumped this quarter, he said. But my desk outperformed. Closed a refinancing for Robertson Steel, you probably saw it. Dad's nod was immediate. Of course. Impressive. And the house, Mom added, glowing with pride. $500,000. Can you believe it? With the Tesla, too. Michael, you've really made us proud. Michael waved it off modestly. It's not about the car. I just like not paying for gas. Rachel tilted her wrist so the bracelet he'd given her caught the candlelight. He surprised me with this last week, she said, smiling at the diamonds. Feels good to enjoy the rewards of hard work. I moved green beans on my plate. No one asked what I'd been doing. Not the late nights helping kids in Lakewood, not the mural project drying in a school gym. Around this table, success was measured in houses and cars. Emily passed the rolls, Mom said, glancing my way for the first time. Then she turned back to Michael. Your colleagues must admire you with that new title. Michael smiled, pleased. They know the results when they see them. His eyes flicked to me briefly before he looked away. I tightened my grip on my glass. Aunt Linda raised hers slightly toward me, a private signal that I wasn't invisible. That quiet gesture steadied me. The conversation kept rolling, circling around Michael's job, Rachel's jewelry, and vacation plans. Grace stayed quiet. The cranberry sauce sat untouched, glowing red like an ornament no one needed. Then Dad lifted his glass for a toast. At that moment, Michael leaned toward me. His tone was casual, almost playful. "So, Em," he said, still jobless. The words hit the table like a dropped fork. The laughter stopped. Rachel's smile froze. Mom stared at her plate. Dad cleared his throat. A cousin chuckled nervously. I set my fork down on porcelain, the scrape loud in the silence. My pulse quickened, but I met his gaze straight on. Aunt Linda's hand brushed mine under the table, steadying me. Michael leaned back, pleased with himself. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. We worry, you know." Some people looked down at their plates. That was their way of agreeing without speaking. I drew a breath, heavy with time and heat. "Hello to you too," I said calmly. The room froze again. Rachel drank too quickly. Dad tapped his fork. Grace shifted uneasily. Michael only smiled wider, lifting his glass like he had won. Maybe the rest of them saw it as brotherly teasing. To me, it felt like a judgment. Sitting there surrounded by polished china and flickering candles, I knew this wasn't just dinner. It was a trial. And Michael had just called his first witness. By the time the sweet potatoes circled the table, the evening had settled into its rhythm, Michael in the spotlight, the rest of us filling the seats. Mom guided conversation like a conductor flicking her wrists. "Michael, how was the bank holiday party?" "Rachel, did you ever choose the backsplash tile?" Dad tell them about the HOA mess. Dad happily obliged, spinning a story about the neighbor's inflatable Santa collapsing across the property line. Everyone laughed on cue. I did too, mostly, because the image of Santa deflating onto the azaleas really was ridiculous. But Mom wasn't going to let the focus wander for long. "And how's that loan portfolio?" she asked Michael. Admiration thick in her voice. $500,000 for the house, such a steal, and the neighborhood so safe. "Appraised above ask," Michael replied, smooth as the shine on his cufflink. "Tesla's just a perk from work. We have a charger in the garage. Efficient." Rachel placed a hand on his sleeve, with the kind of practiced grace you'd see in a magazine spread. "Show them the bracelet," she said, turning to me before raising her wrist. Diamonds winked across the table. "He surprised me last week." It was nothing, Michael said, but his smile said otherwise. Every eye followed the sparkle on Rachel's arm. Then Mom pivoted. "Grace, you should take a page from Rachel's book, sweetie. Everything she does is so tidy." Grace pressed her fork into the marshmallow topping until it caved her voice flat. "Noted." And then it was my turn, though, only in the way teachers call on the quiet student who hasn't spoken. "And you, Emily, how is everything?" I knew that trick. Everything meant pick something safe, not too personal, nothing that makes anyone uncomfortable. "Busy," I said. "We just finished a mobile pantry route that— Did you hear Michael ran the turkey trot?" Mom cut me off, her face glowing. 8-minute mile. 7:59, Michael corrected smoothly. But who's counting? Dad jumped in to pile on. "Tell them about your client dinner," he said, proud and paternal, giving Michael the kind of scaffolding that held him up higher than the rest of us could ever reach. "Not much to tell," Michael said with a shrug designed to invite questions. We closed. I stood up for the team. "You know how it is." $500,000, Mom repeated again, almost reverent. "Such a blessing," Michael quipped. Praise favorable interest rates, and even I cracked a smile. A good line was a good line. Still, the more the conversation circled him, the smaller I became. I passed dishes, said please and thank you, and filled water glasses. The more useful I made myself, the easier it was for them to leap right over my part in the story. Then Mom, maybe trying to sound generous, set her fork down and looked around the table like a general surveying the field. "Michael has everything lined up," she said warmly. "A good job, a beautiful home, a plan." Sometimes I wish she paused just for drama. I wish Emily had even half of that. The words hung there soft but heavy. A hush rose like steam. Aunt Linda's eyebrows lifted but didn't move further, like a bird deciding not to take off. Grace glanced at me, then back to her plate so quickly it felt like a flinch. "I have a lot," I said finally. My voice was steady when I wanted it to crack. Just different. Of course, Mom replied. Of course. She buttered a roll tenderly as if kindness balanced the sting. It's just, stability is nice. At your age. Rachel's cheeks glowed with a smug satisfaction. Stability is so undervalued, she chimed in. I tell my Pilates girls this all the time. Her words stung not because of what she said, but because she said it in alliance with Mom. Mom hadn't meant to be cruel. That made it worse. She'd reduced me to a fraction half of and cloaked it in affection. Under the table, Grace brushed my knee with her hand, quick as a secret. Aunt Linda, refusing to let the silence win, turned to me. What's kept you busy lately? Em, she asked gently. I opened my mouth, ready to talk about the kids in Lakewood, about the mural we'd painted together, about something that mattered. But Michael cut in, his timing flawless. I actually have some news, he announced, voice bright, pulling every gaze back to him like a magnet. We're exploring a new product line. I might lead the Cleveland initiative. The table came alive again, conversation buzzing like bees around honey. Oh, honey, Mom said, her eyes shining as if Rachel's bracelet had lit them up. That would be amazing. And just like that, my story folded back inside me, waiting for another day. That's what happens when no one asks you. Learn to keep your stories quiet. The mashed potatoes came the way they always did in our family, skins left on butter, heavy beaten until they were clouds. I spooned them onto my plate and ate them like memory, as if food could patch over an emptiness that had nothing to do with hunger. 3 Christmases ago, I had walked away from a job with a cubicle, a badge, and fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly. There hadn't been a dramatic blow-up. No shouting boss, no broken copier. Just me at my desk one morning, realizing I could not sell my energy to a spreadsheet that meant nothing to me. My resignation came in a quiet Word document, and my hand was steady when I typed it. Mom had cried. Dad frowned the way mortgage-paying men do. Michael had called it impulsive, sliding me an article about how women negotiate poorly. Rachel had sent a podcast titled, Find Your Passion. I never hit play. My passion then was walking out the door. And I did. For months I drifted until the community center in Lakewood became my anchor. The pay was scraps at first, stipends, grants, small projects, but the work was alive. Kids needed homework. Help parents needed food boxes. Neighborhoods needed someone to remember their names. I learned the geography of need in that city. Which schools bent rules for the right reasons, which grocers would slip extra cans into donation bins. I wrote proposals that sounded like prayers. Sometimes they were answered. The first Thanksgiving after I quit, Michael raised a glass to the family and said some of us were making bold moves while others were still finding themselves. The room laughed. I held my smile like a bandage pressed against a wound. Grace followed me out to the porch that night, the cold air sharp pine wreath still hanging from November. It's not fair, she whispered. You're the bravest person I know. I'm just the one who made a choice, I told her. If I let her call me brave, I'd have to wear the cape, and I didn't want capes. I wanted quiet. Tonight, as Michael ticked off his new promotions and Mom nodded like an audience, I could hear that old laughter again. Every nod from Dad replayed the moment he had looked away when I told him I'd be fine. He hadn't called me a liar, but he hadn't asked for proof either. Old hurts circled the table like ghosts waiting for their cue. Aunt Linda leaned in. You know, she murmured, my father didn't speak to me for 3 months after I chose nursing instead of med school. He told the neighbors I was just taking time off. Then one day a patient told me I'd saved his life. That was the voice I decided to believe. I remember I said softly, You told me that when I was 9. She smiled. And I'll tell you again. Because 32 is just 9, but with taxes. I laughed an actual laugh, and it startled me. Rachel turned her head, quickly, surprised, like she'd heard a wrong note in an orchestra that somehow worked. Then Michael, always needing to reclaim the spotlight, leaned forward. So, Em, what do you actually do now? Day to day. I set my fork down. He had asked a question, but his smirk made sure it wasn't clean. I coordinate mentorship programs, I said evenly. Tutoring, skill-building, job prep. We run a mobile pantry route. I'm on a crisis response team. It's work. He tilted his head like he was appraising a stray. But that's not a real job. It is work, Aunt Linda said quickly, her voice steady but kind. Michael didn't bother to respond. He had already turned back to his plate. For a moment silence stretched. I tasted the bitterness that had lived in me for years, the same bitterness that had followed me onto porches and into empty bedrooms after holiday dinners. But tonight I recognized it, and because I recognized it, I refused to swallow it whole. I set my glass down. The clink was louder than I expected. Grace's eyes darted to mine, then down again. Rachel smiled faintly as if pleased that Michael had landed another point. Mom smoothed her napkin and avoided my gaze. In that pause, I breathed. Old wounds had spoken, but they didn't get to close the chapter. Somewhere in the living room, the TV glowed quietly, its screen waiting. I didn't know then what it would deliver, only that for once something outside this table might give me back a voice. And I was ready to hear it. Dad sharpened the carving knife like the turkey demanded precision. The rasp of steel filled the room, slowing every fork and breath until silence wrapped itself around us. Ritual has that power even in families that rarely pray. The first slice fell. Michael cleared his throat softly, just shy of modest, and the table tipped its attention his way. I actually have some news, he said, lowering his eyes as if the words embarrassed him. My team at the bank exceeded targets. I took a point on a restructuring deal, closed it with a margin I'm proud of. The VP hinted, more than hinted, that I'll be stepping into leadership next year. Mom's gasp came out like steam escaping a kettle. Michael. Rachel raised her wrist, the bracelet shooting shards of light across the table. He's being modest. The bonus was generous. Grace kept her eyes on the potatoes she'd sculpted into hills and valleys. Congrats, she murmured, voice neutral enough to be either supportive or tired. Michael wasn't finished. He lifted his wine glass, swirling it the way you'd swirl fortunes in tea leaves. Made some moves earlier than consensus. A couple positions. Nothing crazy. You just have to pay attention. Dad nodded. Mom glowed. The table hummed with approval. Aunt Linda's hand found mine under the linen. When I chose nursing, she said conversationally, her words meant for everyone, my cousin told me I was settling. Then he called me from the ER when his daughter was sick. Funny how that works. Michael laughed. We need all kinds, Aunt Elle. Healthcare finance tech. Emily's community thing. The phrase hung in the air like something dropped in soup bobbing without flavor. He could have said program. He could have said outreach. He chose things. I tucked it away like evidence. Rachel leaned toward him, perfume light as clean tile. Michael's stamina is incredible. He's up at 5 in the office by 7, still home in time to cook. Discipline, Michael added, flashing me a grin that landed like a coach's pep talk to the bench warmer. You ever think about structure M routines? I have them, I answered. They just don't look like yours. What do they look like? His tone was smooth, offering rope while making sure I'd tangle in it. Images came fast. The mother with 2 jobs, needing a ride to the clinic, the boy who flinched at a balloon pop, the girl who needed FAFSA explained in her first language. They look like calls at 11 p.m., I said. Early mornings packing boxes. Circles of folding chairs. People who thought they didn't matter found out they do. Michael smiled the way you do when someone says something you didn't plan to respect. He raised his glass and let his voice travel the table. It's good you're keeping busy, but you're still unemployed, right? The laughter came small but sharp, rippling like a tide that didn't need to be a wave to sting. Rachel didn't laugh outright. She smirked into her glass. That smirk was enough. My chest tightened, the kind of ache that comes from pressing on an old bruise. I searched the table. Mom's lips pinched into a line. Dad's jaw asked me silently to let it go. Aunt Linda lifted her hand, slightly the referee without whistle. Michael, she said softly. That's enough. It's a joke, he replied. We tease each other. Always have. Grace's fork chimed against her plate, one clean note. Her eyes flicked to mine, held then dropped. A signal, not yet. I stood without meaning to. Chair legs scraped the floor, a violin string caught mid-cry. The room froze. "Excuse me," I said, voice, even though my skin buzzed. I crossed into the living room 5 steps and stopped in front of the television. The screen glowed quiet blue, paused earlier on a news segment. Dad must have left running. Behind me, Michael's voice picked up like nothing had happened, smooth as sports commentary. "She's sensitive," Rachel murmured. Mom shushed her softer still. And then the TV unmuted itself when my knee brushed the remote. Headlines scrolled, then a segment rolled, "Year-End Community Heroes." The anchor's tone softened, reverent. Faces flashed across the screen. First a teacher with a coat drive, then a bus driver who pulled a child from a snowbank, and then me. Not curated, not holiday polished. Just grainy phone footage from that day in Lakewood. The rush of bodies, the chaos, my frame moving without pause toward 2 kids in danger. A still shot followed my hand on a boy's shoulder, both of us trembling. Local Hero Award 2022. The reporter's voice lifted, for quick thinking and extraordinary courage. Behind me, silverware hit porcelain. Feet shifted. The air thickened into a hush. "That's Emily," someone whispered. It was David Collins, the neighborhood reporter Mom had invited out of habit. He stared at the screen, stunned. "That's her." The room tilted. The story I had kept quiet. The story I'd never planned to tell here filled my parents' living room in high definition. I had wanted an invisible Christmas. Instead, the TV handed me a public one. My face was the headline now, and there was no hiding. The living room was dim, washed in the blue glow of the paused TV. I stood in it, my reflection faint in the dark glass, while the chatter from the dining room wavered like a signal slipping in and out. Behind me, forks scraped plates, laughter tried to recover, but the rhythm had cracked. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to come back, to sit down, to laugh along, to shrink myself into the role they'd always assigned the sister who couldn't quite keep up. But my body refused. My chest tightened, in the kind of way you only get from carrying years of swallowed words. Silence doesn't just happen in a family, it grows. It thickens until it presses on you louder than any shout. That night it filled the Carter house like smoke. I caught Dad rubbing the edge of his jaw the same way he always did when he disapproved but didn't want to fight. His eyes stayed on his plate, heavy with judgment he wouldn't speak out loud. Mom sighed into her napkin, a sound so soft but sharp enough to slice. To her, I wasn't resisting, I was embarrassing her. Aunt Linda didn't move. She sat with her wineglass in hand, her bracelets glinting faintly, her eyes steady on me as if she knew this silence wasn't mine to carry alone. Grace at the far end of the table looked smaller than usual. Her fork sat anchored in mashed potatoes she wasn't eating, her shoulders tense like she was carrying my weight alongside her own. She didn't look at me, but I felt her. That unspoken sister's language, "I'm here, but I'm scared too." I wanted to speak. God, I wanted to. I wanted to tell them what my life actually looked like. To show them the mornings spent loading boxes into vans, the nights explaining FAFSA forms to worried parents. The kids who clung to me because they didn't have anyone else to ask. I wanted them to see that I wasn't a failure. I was building something, just not the kind of something they valued. But I knew if I spoke, then the words would drop like stones into water. They wouldn't ripple. They wouldn't move anyone. So I stayed quiet. My hand brushed the armrest of the couch. I thought about escaping upstairs to the guest room, letting them finish their meal in peace, letting the silence swallow me whole. I had done that before, too many times, and that was when the sound broke through. The TV blinked alive, its black screen jumping into color. A voice clear and formal carried into the room, "Tonight we honor our local heroes." Everyone turned toward the screen. Forks froze midair. Glasses hovered. The silence shifted now, tethered to the glow from the television. I stiffened, realizing too late what was happening. The segment was short, just a reel of faces the city had decided were worth remembering. A teacher who started a breakfast program. A bus driver who pulled a child out of traffic. Their names scrolled across the bottom of the screen in neat white letters. And then me. The image was grainy, pulled from cell phone footage 2 years old. I froze as my own face appeared, caught in motion. That day in Lakewood rose up in me like a wave. The hallways echoed with panic kids too small to know where to run a boy with fear and a weapon he should never have had. I hadn't thought. I had just moved, pulling 2 kids into a classroom, holding the door standing in the gap while chaos tore through the corridor. Someone's phone had captured it, shaky but undeniable. Months later, the mayor had said my name at a podium, but I had avoided the spotlight. I hadn't wanted to be a story. Now the story has come for me. Emily Carter. The anchor's voice carried into the dining room, warm, reverent. Recipient of the Local Hero Award 2022, recognized for extraordinary courage during the Lakewood school shooting. The photo that followed made my throat tighten. Me awkward in the stage lights, a plaque in my hands, the kids from the center cheering in the front row. I had wanted to disappear even then. Tonight I couldn't. The gasp came first from someone at the table I barely knew, one of Mom's friends. Then whispers rippled, names tumbling out like marbles. That's Emily. Our Emily. Oh my God. And then David Collins, the neighbor, the part-time reporter, exhaled sharply, loud enough for everyone to hear. Holy! He cut himself off, hand to his mouth, but the words slipped anyway, reverent and raw. That's Emily. The silence shifted again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. For the first time all night, every eye in that room was on me, and none of them looked away. Michael's fork clattered onto his plate. Rachel's bracelet slid against the table as she shifted, color rising in her face. Mom pressed her napkin to her lips. Dad stared, blinking as though he was recalibrating who I was. I stood there in the blue glow, the story playing on without me. I didn't have to say a word. The TV had done it for me. And in that moment I realized something I had never believed before. Sometimes vindication doesn't arrive in arguments or defenses. Sometimes it arrives in 3 minutes of broadcast, undeniable, while your family has no choice but to watch. The television flickered back to life like it had been waiting for its cue. The program was a year-end special, just a 3-minute segment highlighting local stories the city thought worth celebrating. A teacher who'd built a free breakfast program, a bus driver who'd pulled a child out of traffic. Smiles, applause, gratitude. And then the reel shifted. I stopped breathing. The image was grainy, captured from someone's phone 2 years ago in Lakewood. That day had never left me. A hallway full of panicked children too young to know where to run. A boy holding something that shouldn't have been in his hands. I hadn't paused. I had grabbed 2 kids and pulled them into a classroom, shoving the door shut while chaos spun behind us. It wasn't a decision, not something I thought through. It was instinct. Now here it was, replayed on a screen in my parents' living room. The anchor's voice filled the room, warm and deliberate. Emily Carter, recipient of the Local Hero Award 2022, recognized for extraordinary courage during the Lakewood school incident. My face appeared next, frozen in a photo I had long tried to forget. Me on a stage, awkward in borrowed heels, holding a plaque while spotlights glared in my eyes. In the front row, kids from the community center had clapped until their palms turned red. The anchor continued. Since that day, Emily has dedicated her time to youth mentorship programs, food distribution efforts, and crisis support across Cleveland. Her work has touched hundreds of families. A gasp cut through the room. Not from family, at least not at first. One of the neighbors who'd been invited, a woman I only half remembered, let out a breathless, "Oh my God!" Then came the murmur, a tide of disbelief rolling across the table. That's Emily. Our Emily. I heard my name repeated like it belonged to someone else. And then, sharp enough to crack the silence, David Collins, the neighbor who freelanced for the local paper, the one who always brought a camera to block parties, let slip, "Holy shit. That's Emily." His voice rang with awe. Not insult, but the words hung heavy in the hushed air. Chairs scraped softly as people leaned toward the television. Forks hovered forgotten. For the first time all night, every pair of eyes fixed on me. My mother's hand fluttered to her mouth, napkin trembling between her fingers. My father blinked hard, his jaw tightening in a way I had seen before only at funerals. Grace's fork clattered against her plate as if she'd lost hold of it. Aunt Linda whispered something like a prayer, though I couldn't catch the words. and Michael's face drained in slow motion. His glass paused halfway to his lips. For a man who always had a speech ready, he was suddenly silent. The footage kept rolling. A shot of me outside the community center, hair tied back, handing out bags of groceries. Another clip of me sitting cross-legged on the floor with kids' crayons scattered between us, teaching them how to map their neighborhood in bright chalk colors. Each frame pushed the air tighter in the room. I felt my pulse in my throat steady and loud. This was the story. I had never told my family the part of my life I'd kept separate. They had never asked. And now the whole truth was playing in 1080p in their living room, leaving no room for dismissal. The anchor closed with the line that cinched it. In times of crisis, we find who we can count on. Cleveland counts on Emily Carter. The screen faded to black, the silence so dense it felt physical. Then the TV rolled into another segment, but no one noticed. I became the news. Mom broke first. Emily, her voice cracked like something delicate had given way. Why didn't you tell us? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. How do you explain years of being measured against someone else's success? How do you say you wanted a corner of peace without having to defend it like a case in court? Before I could speak, Michael finally set down his glass. The base hit the table harder than it needed to. His jaw worked, but no words came. It was Rachel who broke the tension for him, reaching for his hand with fingers too deliberate. Her eyes flicked to me, sharp, calculating. The silence stretched long enough for the clink of the radiator to fill it. Grace leaned close, her voice low, meant only for me. They'll never see you the same way again. I nodded faintly, though I wasn't sure if she meant it as comfort or warning. Behind me, the muted screen replayed my name in the ticker, scrolling again and again, Local Hero Award, Emily Carter. And sitting there with the weight of their stares pressing in, I understood something I hadn't before. The verdict Michael had tried to pass earlier, the one about me being still jobless, had just been overturned. The jury wasn't in his favor anymore. The room had shifted, and I was no longer the one on trial. The silence carried more weight than any applause I had ever heard. It pressed down on the room, thick, unrelenting. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I turned slowly back toward the table. Michael was still in his chair, his fingers curled around the stem of his wineglass. For a moment he looked carved out of stone jaw, tight eyes locked on the screen. Then, as if his body betrayed him, the glass slipped. It shattered against the hardwood in an explosion of sound. Red wine splashed across the pale carpet, staining it in branching streaks that crept outward like cracks in ice. The mess spread irreversible, undeniable. Nobody laughed this time. Rachel flinched, pulling her hands into her lap as if the spill might jump onto her. Her face flushed crimson, not from embarrassment for him, but from something sharper. She turned her head as though if she looked away, she could detach herself from the orbit of his humiliation. Mom raised her napkin to her mouth, eyes wide. Her hand trembled just enough that I noticed. Emily. She whispered the name shaped like a confession. You truly did that, her voice cracked on the last word. I thought of all the times she had stayed composed when Michael boasted about his 6-figure bonus, when she had reduced my efforts to half of what he has, when she treated me like an afterthought. She hadn't cracked then. But now seeing me on a screen recognized by strangers, her composure finally broke. Dad's gaze was steady, his face unreadable at first. Then I saw it, the recalibration, the rewiring. The way he blinked, slow and deliberate, like he was adjusting the image of me he had carried for years. I couldn't speak. My throat felt sealed, as though the words I had saved up for a decade had been locked away behind iron. On the screen, the footage continued. A child crying into my shoulder. My hand rested lightly on his back as reporters swarmed with microphones I had refused to touch. I had declined every interview back then, desperate not to be turned into a spectacle. But now the spectacle had forced its way into my parents' living room, uninvited and uncontainable. Michael swallowed. Adam's apple jerked once, then again. His face had lost all color, drained pale under the warm glow of the Christmas candles. He opened his mouth, and what came out was a sound halfway between a laugh and a choke. That's edited, he stammered, forcing the words out. Probably, A coincidence. Lots of people named Emily Carter. Nobody believed him. The room stayed still except for the faint clinking of forks as someone nervously adjusted silverware. The lies landed flat, heavy, lifeless. His denial couldn't compete with the clarity of my face on the screen. Aunt Linda leaned forward, her bracelets catching the light. "Michael," she said softly, but her tone carried weight. "That's your sister." Grace, who had been silent through most of the evening, let out a quiet, shaky laugh. Not cruel, just astonished. She looked at Michael, then at me, then back again. "It's her. We all know it's her." Rachel's lips parted, but no words followed. She pressed them shut again, hiding behind the rim of her wine glass. For years, Michael had carried himself like the only star in the Carter family orbit. His job, his car, his house, his success, all of it had been staged for applause. And now, with one unexpected broadcast, his spotlight had slipped. The weight of silence turned into something else, a shift, a realignment. For the first time, he wasn't untouchable. His grip on the room had faltered. I sat still, the heat from the fireplace brushing the side of my face. Every instinct told me to shrink, to disappear, to make this moment smaller so the room could breathe again. But I stayed. I let it hang in the air, let them look at me, let Michael sit in the ruins of his own performance. The footage looped again, replaying the same clips. My name scrolls across the ticker at the bottom of the screen again and again. Emily Carter. Emily Carter. Emily Carter. Michael lowered his eyes, staring at the red stain blooming on the carpet, as if it might swallow him whole. For once, his silence was louder than anything he had ever bragged about. The room felt altered, like someone had tilted the house and let the air spill out before replacing it with something entirely new. It wasn't loud, not like the laughter that usually followed Michael's stories. It was quieter, heavier, the kind of quiet that rearranges the furniture of a family without moving a single chair. Aunt Linda rose first. She didn't hesitate, didn't glance around for permission. Her footsteps sounded deliberate on the hardwood, and then she was in front of me, wrapping me in the kind of embrace that leaves no room for doubt. Her voice brushed against my ear, low but strong. "Now they see you," she whispered. Her words landed like a stone dropped in water, sending ripples I couldn't control. Around us, murmurs began to stir. Guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier now leaned toward one another, voices carrying words I had never heard directed at me in this house. Amazing. Incredible. I had no idea. A neighbor from across the street who once asked Michael to recommend a mortgage lender but had never asked me anything actually clapped softly, like the news anchor might reappear if he made enough noise. Dad stayed in his chair, but I saw him shrink in it, his shoulders folding in like paper. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, as though the weight of every dinner table judgment had come back to sit in his lap. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, blotting tears that seemed half pride, half something else. Guilt maybe, or the sting of realizing she had underestimated her own daughter. She tried to smile, but it bent at the edges, unsteady. Rachel twisted her bracelet again and again, the diamonds scattering light too brightly against the subdued hush. The sparkle looked out of place now, like sequins at a funeral. Her eyes never met mine. She kept them fixed on her lap, as if to say she hadn't chosen this stage, hadn't agreed to this scene. And Michael, my brother who had greeted me with mockery less than an hour ago, sat stiff as a statue. His face was blotched red, his pride draining faster than the spilled wine had seeped into the carpet. He tried to form words, but his voice betrayed him, trembling. "It's not," he stuttered. "She's exaggerating. People overhype these things." The denial hung there, fragile, a balloon already losing air. Nobody reached to grab it. Nobody gave him the nods of approval he had come to expect. For once, the room wasn't listening to him. I stayed still, my hands folded in front of me. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. For once, I wasn't expected to explain myself, to justify my choices, to defend my worth. The story had been told already on a screen by strangers, with footage no one could argue against. Michael shifted in his seat, desperate for the spotlight that had abandoned him. His hand twitched toward his glass, but the shattered one at his feet reminded everyone of the moment he had lost it. He muttered something about editing, about television exaggeration, but the words sounded hollow. Aunt Linda kept her hand on my back steady and sure. Grace finally lifted her head, her eyes catching mine across the table. She smiled a small private smile, but it was enough to tell me she had been waiting for this. That somewhere inside her she had always known. The silence stretched, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for me. And that's when it hit me. Sometimes vindication doesn't arrive with raised voices or long speeches. It doesn't storm in through arguments or defenses. Sometimes it arrives as quiet proof playing across a television in your parents' living room, undeniable, unspinnable, forcing everyone who doubted you to watch without a chance to look away. I hadn't asked for this moment. I hadn't planned it. But standing there in the thick of it, I understood it was mine. And there was no going back. The television clicked into silence, cutting off mid-sentence. The screen froze on my face, awkward, grainy, paused beneath the anchor's headline. The room held its breath. Forks hovered. Eyes darted, but no one dared to speak first. And then Grace moved. The sound was tiny at first, her fork set down with a deliberate clink that carried more weight than Michael's broken glass had minutes earlier. She stood slowly smoothing the skirt of her dark sweater dress, like someone gathering armor, not fabric. Her shoulders rose with a deep inhale, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled just for a heartbeat before finding a strength none of us had ever heard from her before. Enough! It sliced through the hush. She didn't shout, but she didn't need to. The word itself seemed to rearrange the air. I've watched this for years, she continued, her tone stronger now, carrying across the table. Michael tearing Emily down. Mom and Dad pretending it's harmless. Rachel adding her little jabs, always with that smile. Her eyes flicked across the table, sharp as broken glass, catching each person she named. I've kept my mouth shut because I didn't want to be next, but I can't anymore. The hush deepened into something brittle. No one moved. Even the candles seemed to hold their flames steadier as though listening. Grace turned toward me, her face softening, her voice shifting from accusation to loyalty. Emily, I've seen what you've done. I follow every program, every post. I've been to the center. I've seen the kids who look up to you. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she straightened her chin, lifting with a conviction that seemed to grow taller than her frame. She pivoted back to Michael. And I am proud of you, she said to me before turning her sharp gaze back at him. Michael, you should be ashamed. The words hit like stones thrown into a still pond. Shock rippled outward, disturbing every carefully balanced face around the table. For years, Michael had been untouchable, his arrogance cushioned by parental approval, his cruelty excused as banter. Grace's defiance cracked the surface. Mom whispered Grace, but her voice lacked the steel it usually carried. She sounded like a mother pleading, not commanding. Grace didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders the way I'd seen her do in high school when she stepped onto a debate stage, nerves masked by resolve. I mean it. Tonight you mocked her in front of everyone. You laughed while she swallowed it like always. And now, thanks to that screen, we all see who really deserves respect. Rachel shifted in her chair, her bracelet tinkling against the table as she tried to busy her hands. But the gesture was nervous, not triumphant. Her usual air of superiority had wilted under Grace's words. Dad's hand clenched around his napkin, knuckles white. He opened his mouth as though to meditate, then closed it again. For once, he had nothing to offer. No joke, no deflection. Michael's jaw worked, but nothing came out. His usual arsenal, sarcasm, charm, numbers, and titles sounded hollow before he even spoke them. He sat rigid, face pale, caught between fury and humiliation. Aunt Linda leaned back, studying Grace with something close to awe. Well, she said quietly, but with a kind of finality, there it is. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full-charged. I sat frozen, my breath tight in my chest. I had learned to live without allies at this table, to armor myself in invisibility. And now Grace, my little sister, who had spent so much of her life blending into the background, had stood up and spoken the words I had never dared to demand. My throat burned. Not from pain, from something closer to gratitude, raw and overdue. I hadn't expected it to come from her, and maybe that's why it struck so deep. Grace sat down slowly, but the weight of her words didn't leave the room. They hung there undeniable, hovering over Michael's shattered glass, over Rachel's silence, over our parents' stunned faces. And for the first time in years, the balance of power at that table shifted, not because of me, but because of her. The night wasn't over, but the ground beneath us had already changed. Michael laughed sharp and brittle, the sound of glass underfoot. It wasn't joy, not even amusement, it was panic, dressed up in bravado. He leaned forward, wine still dripping from where the stem of his glass had shattered earlier. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to disguise it with a dismissive wave. "Come on," he said, voice pitched too high. "You can't honestly believe this makes her some kind of hero. She quit a stable job. She's been drifting for years. One award, one lucky break doesn't erase a lifetime of irresponsibility." The words scratched the air, desperate, each syllable sharp enough to sting. He glanced around the table, scanning for nods for allies. His eyes landed on Dad, then Mom, then Rachel, searching for anyone to throw him a rope. None came. The silence pressed back against him. For the first time, his voice didn't fill the room. It bounced off the walls and fell flat. David Collins cleared his throat. The neighbor, the casual guest, the man with the camera, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low but steady. "I was there that day," he said, his gaze fixed on Michael like a verdict. "I covered the story. I saw it with my own eyes. Your sister saved lives." He paused, let the words land. "That's not drifting. That's courage. The kind most of us pray we'd have if the moment ever came." A ripple moved across the table, not of laughter this time, but of recognition. Something in the air had shifted, and it tilted away from Michael. Michael's jaw twitched. His mouth opened, then closed. He tried again, lips moving, but no words came. For a man who always had a ready quip, a story, a statistic, his silence was louder than any argument he could have made. Rachel shifted in her seat, cheeks flushed red. Her fingers worried the edge of her napkin until it frayed. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Michael either. Her eyes stayed fixed downward, as if the embroidered hem could rescue her. Mom's lips parted, then closed, then parted again. She looked at me with eyes I hadn't seen in years, uncertain, almost searching. Dad leaned back in his chair, his usual composure unraveling. He fiddled with his watch, then his cuff, then stilled his gaze trained on his son with quiet disappointment. Michael's mask cracked. I saw the shield of superiority he'd polished for years, the armor of titles, bonuses, cars, and square footage. All of it fissured in an instant, leaving the man beneath exposed. He didn't look powerful. He didn't look untouchable. He looked small, fragile, humans. And for the first time, I didn't feel crushed by him. I didn't feel like the younger sister was overshadowed or the failure in the family story. I felt steady. Not triumphant, just steady, as if the ground beneath me finally belonged to me again. Grace reached across the table, her hand brushing mine with a squeeze meant for me alone. Aunt Linda nodded once, her bracelets chiming softly, a private applause in the silence. Michael tried again, voice breaking this time. She's just been lucky. You don't know the whole picture. Emily's choices. Her choices saved children. David interrupted firmly. That's the whole picture. No one contradicted him. Michael sank back in his chair, eyes darting, throat working, like he was swallowing something bitter. He looked around once more, searching for the certainty that had always been his. It wasn't there anymore. For years, he had cast shadows across this table, and tonight, for the first time, the light had shifted. It didn't fall on him. It fell on me. And he couldn't stand the sight of it. The dining room no longer belonged to Michael. For as long as I could remember, he had commanded it, his stories, his laughter, his smugness, filling every inch until the rest of us shrank in the shadows. But that night the air itself shifted. He sat small at the far end of the table, while the weight of the room pressed down on him instead of lifting him up. The guests exchanged glances, quiet but unmistakable. I read them easily: disappointment, disapproval, even a little pity. Not directed at me, never at me this time, but at Michael. The golden sun, who had always been praised, now looked tarnished, his shine gone dull under the harsh light of truth. Mom. Mom folded her napkin slowly, as though it had suddenly become the most fragile piece of fabric in the world. Her fingers trembled not from age, but from the realization crawling through her. She lifted her eyes to Dad. He met them silent. They didn't need words. Their faces said it clearly enough. We were wrong. The admission didn't come out loud. It didn't need to. For once, their silence wasn't a shield for Michael, it was an indictment. Aunt Linda didn't bother with silence. She straightened in her chair, eyes firm, voice carrying through the air like a bell. Michael, she said, no softness in it. Mocking your sister while she was out there saving children, that's not just careless. That's shameful. The word hung there heavy. Michael flinched. His hand twitched toward the shards of his broken wine glass on the floor, as if forgetting it was gone. His fingers hovered empty before falling uselessly into his lap. For once, no one rushed to smooth over his mistake. Not even Mom. Rachel cleared her throat, a brittle sound. Excuse me? She murmured, eyes down. She pushed back her chair and left the table, her heels clattering down the hall. Each sharp step echoed like a drumbeat of embarrassment. She hadn't defended him. She hadn't defended me either. She had simply fled, abandoning the man who had always been her stage. Michael sat alone, his face pale under the glow of the chandelier. He tried to smile, tried to summon that easy confidence he wore like cologne. But it didn't come. His jaw worked, his mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing left. Dad cleared his throat, breaking the silence, though his words were directed at me, not at Michael. Emily, he said carefully, we didn't know. You never told us. I lifted my gaze steady. You never asked. That landed harder than I expected. Mom's face crumpled, her eyes wet. Dad's shoulders sagged. For years they had propped up Michael, feeding his pride while brushing me to the side. Now the weight of that choice settled on them. Guests began murmuring, voices rippling around the table. She's incredible, one said softly. I had no idea, said another. Compliments, astonishment, respect, all things I had never been given in this house were now spilling freely, aimed at me. Michael's knuckles whitened around his fork. He looked like he wanted to shout, to claw back the attention. But the current had turned, and nothing he said could reverse it. Aunt Linda leaned forward, her bracelets chiming as if punctuating her words. Respect, she said. Looking at me is earned by what you do when no one is watching. And Emily has done more than any of us realized. That deserves acknowledgement. I swallowed hard. For a moment, the years of being belittled, overlooked, second-guessed, all of it pressed against me. And then just as quickly it lifted. Because justice had arrived. Not in fiery speeches or loud confrontations. Not even in my own defense. It arrived quietly, undeniably, in the way the room turned its back on Michael and faced me instead. For the first time, I didn't need to fight for a place at this table. The table itself had shifted to make room for me. And Michael, once the center of it all, sat in the coldest corner, left with nothing but his own broken reflection. I didn't need to argue anymore. I didn't need to defend myself or prove my worth at that table. The truth had spoken louder than anything I could have said, and it wasn't coming from me, it had come from that television screen, from the voices of strangers who had seen what I had done. Dinner continued, but the air was different. The chatter softened, the laughter subdued. For the first time in years, people turned to me with questions not about Michael's latest deal, not about Rachel's bracelet, not about the square footage of some new house. They asked me about the kids at the center, about the programs, about the food drives and the workshops. What are the kids like? Most one of Mom's friends leaned forward, her tone almost eager. They like it when someone shows up for them, I said simply. Homework, help learning to fix a bike, painting a mural together. It's not about what we do, it's about being there. There was no need to flourish, no need for bragging. The truth stood steady on its own. Grace slid her hand under the table, her fingers brushing mine in a silent promise. I see you. I'm with you. That gesture carried more weight than all the diamonds Rachel had flashed that evening. Aunt Linda leaned close, her voice low but strong. "You carried yourself with dignity," she whispered. "Let them sit with their shame. That's their work to do now, not yours." Her words wrapped around me like a shield. For once I didn't feel exposed. I felt whole. Dad cleared his throat. Once, twice. His fork scraped against porcelain as though it might buy him time. He looked at me, eyes uncertain, as if groping for words he had never practiced saying. An apology lingered there unfinished. Mom dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, her gaze fixed firmly on her plate. She didn't look up. Maybe she couldn't. The woman who had measured me against Michael for years now had to reckon with a truth she hadn't made space for. I didn't push them. I didn't need to. The silence between us said enough. The food moved around the table, but the hierarchy had collapsed. Michael sat stiff, cheeks drained of color. Rachel hadn't returned from wherever she had hidden herself. The guests avoided his gaze, their small talk drifting toward me instead. For the first time in that house, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the afterthought, and yet I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk the way Michael would have. I simply answered their questions one by one, my voice, even my shoulders light. Vindication didn't feel loud. It felt like a release. When the last plate was cleared, I rose first. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood. I smoothed my coat from the back of the chair and slipped my arms into the sleeves. The fabric felt familiar, like an old friend waiting patiently for me to return. "Emily," Mom said suddenly, her voice thin. I paused at the doorway. She didn't continue. She only pressed her napkin to her lips and nodded once small, as though trying to give me something but unable to form it into words. I nodded back. That was enough for now. I thanked the guests as I moved past them, a small smile on my lips. They watched me differently now, their eyes softer, curious, even admiring. For once, I didn't shrink under it. At the front door, I pushed it open and the cold night air rushed in. Snow was still falling, steady, soft. It clung to the porch railing, it covered the driveway. It erased the marks of the cars outside. The whole street shimmered under a fresh layer of white. The cold kissed my cheeks, sharp but cleansing. I stepped onto the porch, my boots crunching in the powder, the air biting but somehow kind. For the first time in years, I walked outside without carrying the weight of their judgment on my back. Behind me, the house buzzed with whispers, confused, regretful, unfinished conversations still hanging in the air. That was theirs to sort out, not mine. Ahead of me, the night stretched wide open and waiting. I smiled. Not for them, not for the guests still inside, not for Michael sulking in his corner. I smiled for myself, for the younger version of me who had once believed she would never be seen, for the woman I had become who finally knew she didn't need their permission to exist. And if my voice could have carried through every home where someone sat, dismissed, overlooked, or belittled by the people who should have loved them most, I would have said this: if your family ever mocks you, don't despair. Truth has its own way of arriving. Sometimes it comes quietly, sometimes in the very moment they least expect it. And when it does, you won't need to fight for your place anymore. It will already